So this setup should look somewhat familiar if you've followed my exploits with the Twin Otter Extended on this channel. But today we're not looking at the Twin Otter Extended. This is X-Plane 11 and I have the RW Designs Twin Otter in play. I've been playing about with that and playing about with X-Plane 11, trying to get to know them both really, with a particular emphasis on trying to work out how to, well, whether I can, and if so, how to hook up the functions of that aircraft to my hardware, buttons and switches. And the emphasis today is really going to be my first impressions of the RW Designs Twin Otter. I say first impressions, now I'm not going to do a full review of this aircraft, but I've played with it in enough detail to get enough of an impression about whether I'm going to persist with it. So I'm going to try and convey that to you today. I'm going to show you me flying it, and I might say a little bit about how I've been doing in getting the buttons and switches hooked up. So I'm going to do, let's say, 4 things. First thing I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about what I've got set up to give you some context for what you're seeing when I'm flying it around. Then I'm going to do perhaps I'll attempt a cold and dark startup with some reference to the checklist that I use in my Twin Otter sim. And that should give us an overview of the level of detail to which this aircraft is simulated. Once I've done that, I'm going to fly it around. The main reason, I suppose, driving me to X-Plane was to try and get a sense of how the aircraft dynamics handle in X-Plane compared to FSX, but also how very specifically how the turboprop engines are simulated, because it's widely regarded that in FSX the simulation of turboprop engines is fairly abysmal and unrealistic. So I'm going to fly it around with those 2 things in mind really. I want to see how the engines handle, how that affects the controllability of the aircraft, particularly on the critical phases of flight, notably the approach, but also just to get a sense of the general handling dynamics of, well, it's going to be difficult to separate what's X-Plane from what's the specifics of the implementation of this aircraft, the Twin Otter. So that might get a little bit muddled in the telling, but I will try and comment on which is which as we go. And then the final thing I'm going to do is take a look at a very specific area of this aircraft implementation, and that's going to be the Autopilot, because the Autopilot, certainly in my experiments with the Twin Otter Extended, has played a very large part in that. And some of the fun of flying the aircraft is getting to know the Autopilot and to be able to use it to good advantage. So that's going to be a bit of a case study in the sense of how well the RW Designs Twin Otter stands up. So that's what's coming, and most of that will be with me sort of sitting in the cockpit talking you through that. But the first thing then, before I get into that, what have I got set up? Well, if you can see the panel here behind me, this is pretty much the same panel exactly as I have in my Twin Otter Extended setup. There's one difference which you might notice, which is that a lot of these indicators are actually illuminated. I should say that I've got a partial panel implemented. It's all displayed, but it's not all working. Now, you may remember me saying that these instruments are running on Air Manager, and they were implemented by Russ Barlow as a kind of a test to demonstrate some of the more advanced capabilities of Air Manager. And I have discovered, rather fortunately, that when Russ started this, he started with the basic 6-pack, and he did actually code them to work in X-Plane as well as FSX. So with one exception, the basic 6-pack works right off the bat with X-Plane, and indeed with X-Plane 11, and I didn't have to do anything to get those to work. The exception is the ADI, and that's really because the ADI in the Twin Otter Extended is actually quite sophisticated. It has flight director steering bars on, it has obviously the attitude indicator, and Russ has also done a lot of work on that to make the gyro erection look realistic and so on. So I think he gave up at that point on making it X-Plane compatible. So what I've done is, in practice, I've swapped out the Twin Otter Extended specific ADI. I've put in the Beechcraft Baron ADI, which fits nicely in here. It looks fairly in keeping with the rest of the panel, and that works out of the box. This is a default gauge that comes with Air Manager. And interestingly enough, I'll just say one sort of thing that's looking ahead to what we're going to talk about later. The Beechcraft Baron ADI actually has steering bars for the flight director on, and I've discovered that they work. They actually follow the operation of the Autopilot, which is a clue that this Autopilot is implemented using the underlying default features of X-Plane. But it's a bonus, you know. For now it means I do have the flight director bars, which are actually absent from the ADI in the virtual cockpit. And if you read the documentation, such as it is for the RW Designs Twin Otter, you know, the rationale for that is, oh, this is an aircraft that's presumed to have had the Autopilot retrofitted to it, so it doesn't have the flight director head fitted to the ADI. That's, you know, make of that what you will. At the end of the day, in my 2D panel, I do have a fully functional ADI, as well as airspeed, altitude, HSI, vertical speed indicator, and turn coordinator. Everything else you see on the panel is non-functional, so I have to rely on looking at the virtual cockpit if I want to see the other gauges. Actually, that's not quite true. I've also got the GPS displayed in its regular place on its own little monitor there, and I have hooked up all the functions to drive the GPS from my hardware panel. And if you're interested in this, I might do a separate video on how I've done that. I've used spad.next, which, you know, the more I tinker with this program, the more impressed I am about it. You know, I think they've made a bit of a blunder continuing to call it spad.next. You know, that SPAD stands for SciTech Panels Advanced Driver. It was originally conceived as something to drive the SciTech panels, but it does so much more. I haven't touched the SciTech panels yet, but I've used it to hook up my buttons and switches. So like I say, I might do a video on that separately. But I've got a fully functional GPS. In the RW Designs Twin Otter, it has the GNS 530, which I believe is the default GPS in X-Plane. Whether it's a full implementation of the GNS 530 is yet, well, in fact it's not. You know, I've already seen some omissions, but it's more sophisticated than the G500 in FSX, shall we say. And it looks good, and it works. You know, it's familiar to me from the Twin Otter Extended, so we got that going as well. I've done some minimal hooking up of the Autopilot functions to my hardware buttons and switches. That's not a complete success, as we'll see later on. I've also hooked up the rotary controls for the nav instruments, so nav 1 and nav 2, for the Colesman window and the heading bug on the HSI, which obviously I need when I'm using the Autopilot. I think that's all I've hooked up. Oh, the flap control as well, and of course the flight controls. That's all hooked up. Everything else should look pretty much the same as it looks when I'm flying my Twin Otter Extended. I'm going to be using the Track IR to control the view. I'm going to be looking in the virtual cockpit for some of the gauges. The virtual cockpit looks somewhat similar to the Twin Otter Extended. Well, I mean, very similar at first glance. It's not done to the same standard, but there it is. Let's get started and we'll have a closer look at some of this. Alright, so here we are in the cockpit and we're going to do the cold and dark start. I've got the checklist to hand. I'm going to pay the barest attention to this because it's largely irrelevant. Okay, the fuel levers are off, the props are in the fully feathered position. We're going to put those forward. The ignition switch should be set to normal. Now the ignition switch is not implemented in this, that's just a dummy. We do have switches for the igniters. They're set to both now, but in practice I don't think that makes any difference. DC master switch on. Now we've got, don't forget on the Twin Otter we've got DC master, we've got external battery switch, and I've noticed first of all you can't put this to external, you can put it to battery or off. When you put it to battery the electrics come on even if the DC master is off. That doesn't seem right to me either. And we're ready to go. You should have seen some things on the panel come to light. You've seen the panel lighting come on, and actually the instruments down here are now visible. I have to say this virtual cockpit's not very well rendered. When it's in shadow the instruments look very shoddy. If I just turn off the battery so the lights go off, you know, that's how the unilluminated instruments look, and sometimes they even look worse than that. They look very dark for some reason I can't actually fathom. Anyway, for now, back to the plot. We're going to have the DC master on, switch the battery. So we've got power to the panel, we've got various caution lights displayed there. Don't forget my caution lights are not working on the 2D panel. We're going to skip straight to the engine start. So we've got the fuel levers, again on the checklist they're supposed to be off, and then what you would do is spin the engine up, watch the gas generator gauge, and then introduce fuel. Now if we just attempt to do that, we're going to see the first problem. We'll start the right engine first. If I flip the switch to the right, you'll hear the engine winding up. Now we should be looking at the gas generator gauge to know when to put fuel in, but the gas generator gauge isn't moving, so that's not right. So what we actually need to do in practice, we've got to switch the boost pumps on as well. I think they're on now. There's no sound to tell you that the boost pumps are on. We go with the right engine first, we'll spin it up, and we'll just listen by ear for when to put the fuel in. Let's do it, say, that sound effect's inappropriate. So we've introduced fuel, we've got the gas generator is coming up now, and the prop RPM is coming up, torque is off the stop, T5's gone up a bit, and oil pressure, and fuel flow, and oil temperature. So that all looks fairly normal. The oil pressure warning light's gone out, so that's normal as well. Do the same for the left engine. Oh, there's deer running past the plane. I think they're deer. I'm not sure they are. It's supposed to be deer. There's a nice train going past as well. We're at Fullerton Airport in Southern California, and there is a train track goes past the end of the runway. Now I'm just showing those engines down to demonstrate something else about this. I mean, that's whole startup sequence, you know, with the gauges and so on, isn't very authentic, and in fact, although I did it somewhat by the checklist there, what you're going to find is if you just put the fuel levers on and then you spin up the engine, you can actually see the engine out of the window there. That's quite a nice animation compared to how it works in FSX. So the engine starts like that. If you tried to do that in the Twin Otter Extended, or I believe in the real Twin Otter, you'd get an engine fire. So the level of simulation of this startup system, at least, is minimal, shall we say. So let's get us up in the air. Now just something to comment on briefly here. I've got the Cytec ProFlight. Now that was one of those inexplicable things. I don't know if that's the thing with X-Plane or a thing with this aircraft model, but you saw the panel there went from being very dark to suddenly fully illuminated. I don't know why that is. It seems to go in and out. Notionally we see the cockpit shadows as we're flying around. They seem to have disappeared here, and we've got full illumination. So if we've got floodlights on in the cockpit, I haven't switched anything on, so that seems to come on and go off at random. But we'll just ignore that. So I've got the Cytec Cessna trim wheel, and I'm using it in its native analog mode here because I haven't satisfactorily got that to work as an encoder in X-Plane, or at least with this aircraft. So that's going to cause us problems with the autopilot, we know that. But the other problem is there's no trim indicator in the cockpit. Now in the Twin Otter Extended, and presumably in the real Twin Otter, the trim wheel is there. And that's probably the trim wheel actually that we're looking at. But it doesn't move, it's not animated, there's no graduations on it, so you can't tell what level of trim you've got set. So that's going to be annoying when we take off. But anyway, let's go. We're going to go out on runway 24, we're going to do a downwind departure to the east, and then probably hook up to the El Toro VOR. Now just something to say, I'm holding the brakes here, dialing this in. These torque readings and the T5 readings seem pretty low. The outside air temperature here is about 15 or something like that degrees Celsius. I think the T5 should be higher than that. If we go to full power, the T5s are still fairly low, way out of the amber zone, and the torque's still fairly modest as well. Anyway, we accelerate pretty darn quickly, and we can take it off there. A little bit late in taking off there, it's doing too much talking. That trim is set far too far forward, I can feel it. I'm just winding it back a bit. So we can turn crosswind up to 3.3. So it's fairly smooth so far. This is a very familiar view. Very much like the view from the Twin Otter Extended. And the view of Southern California in default X-plane scenery isn't too bad. Let's make an immediate downwind turn. We're still on full power, remember. Just when I roll out on the downwind leg, I'll have a look at those engine gauges, see how we're doing. Whoops, not controlling that very well with the rudder. So I'm still going up like a rocket. The T5 is still very modest, way out of the amber zone. Torque's on about 42 psi. Right, we're on a heading of 070 now, which is a little bit inboard of downwind, and we're doing that to miss some airspace there. If you look on it, well, you might or might not see that on the GPS. We're at 3,000 feet. I'm going to level off here temporarily. Again, if we're doing this by the book, we need to be very aware of the airspace. There's that lighting effect again. It's gone dark. It looks like it's gone back to how it should be now, because we've got cockpit shadows over there. I don't know why they disappear. I suspect that is a feature of the aircraft model, not of X-plane, which suggests that the aircraft model is buggy. Actually, for now, I'm going to put it onto Autopilot. And it's not heading hold, altitude hold. If I centre up the HSI, that should take us to El Toro. So I'll put us onto nav. Actually, we're on, we're on GPS. There, we're now onto the VOR. That should take us straight to the El Toro VOR. It's 14.2 miles away. Meanwhile, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial in Palomar. Oh, actually, I've got McClellan Palomar dialed in already on the GPS as a direct to. So we'll activate that. So we've got that dialed in. We're not going to go direct to, but we're going to follow that. I'm just going to look at some things that, if you watch my video on the hand flying the Twin Otter Extended, I'm just going to head to the coast here. That video was primarily about the problems of flying a high wing aircraft with the engines mounted on the wing, and also the issues that you have with turboprop engines. Now, the thing about having the engines mounted high on the wings is you get pitch changes with changes in power. So we're just going to see to what extent that's modelled in this aircraft. We're flying more or less straight and level here at 2,700 feet. We're at about 110 or 112 knots. What we should find, if this is modelled correctly, and if it behaves like the Twin Otter Extended, if we make assertive power changes, we should get significant changes in the pitch. So if I push the power all the way forwards, we should get a fairly aggressive pitch down, and if I pull the power back assertively, we should get a pitch up. Now those things are very important, obviously flying the approach. So we're just going to try them out. So we're about halfway on the power. If I push it all the way to the stop, we're looking for a major pitch down. And actually we don't get that. We've got the slightest twitch of a pitch down, and then we're getting a fairly hefty pitch up. That's a pitch up to 10 degrees so far. I'm just holding it on the rudder. 12 degrees, almost 15 degrees, and we've gone up to almost 2,500 feet per minute on the climb. We've settled at about, well, we'll do a little bit of oscillation, but you see we've got a pitch up there. So that doesn't seem correct. We should have got a pitch down because of course the engines are mounted, the thrust axis is higher than the centre of gravity. So that thrust vector tends to rotate us around the centre of gravity. And if I do an assertive roll off of the power, we should get a pitch up. Again, we got the slightest twitch of a pitch up, and then we get the nose dropping. This is much more conventional behaviour where the thrust axis and the centre of gravity are coincident, like on an aircraft with a, let's say, a single engine mounted on the nose, or something like a Beechcraft with a low wing and the engines mounted on the wing. And if we just check that again, you know, we're in a descent here, but if I go from 0 power to maximum power, I should expect to see a violent nose down pitch. And what I actually get is the opposite. So this suggests to me that whatever the flight dynamics are of this aircraft, they've been copied from some generic profile, if you like, and they're not really modelling the specific behaviour of the A, of the Twin Otter, B, of a high wing aircraft with the engines mounted on the wings. So let's think about those turboprop engines. The other problem that we have, certainly with the modelling in FSX, is making rapid power changes to adjust the rate of descent. There's a huge lag in the response there, so we want to check that out as well. You'll notice incidentally that the engine note doesn't change as I change the power, which it does in FSX. Now I think this is actually more authentic, because don't forget what we've got here is we've got constant speed propellers. That propeller governor in each propeller hub is maintaining the selected RPM, sorry, I'm pointing at the wrong gauge there, the selected RPM of the propeller regardless of the setting of the power levers. If I want to reduce the propeller RPM, I use the prop levers, and so we see the prop RPM coming down. There's also a significant change in the engine note there, which again you don't get that in FSX, or you don't get it in the appropriate situation, and I think that is authentic. We're changing the pitch of the propellers. What you should have seen is the torque should have gone up when I did that, so it's gone back down. Torque comes up because the props are biting into the air harder. So if we go back to fine pitch again, we're interested to what extent it's possible to get rapid changes in the delivered power So we're on about 1,000 feet per minute descent there at 118 knots or so. So let's imagine I want to arrest that descent with a rapid power change. Let's see how well that works. That was an assertive power up. Well, there's a little bit of a lag, and then of course we get that pitch up, which, you know, in pragmatic terms, that's actually helpful. Although in realism terms, that's not strictly how a Twin Otter would, well, it's not at all like a Twin Otter would behave. If I want to increase the rate of descent, so we're currently on a straight level-ish. If I take the power off all the way to idle, pretty much. Again, that pitch down does give us a useful but unrealistic rapid change of rate of descent. So you get the idea. That's very rough and ready. I don't think that tells me very much at all about the modelling of turboprop engines in X-Plane. I think that tells us more about this particular aircraft implementation. There goes the shadows again. Something else that doesn't work very well in FSX with the turboprop engines is the propeller effects. Now, I've established in FSX that feathering the props has no effect. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at that as well. Okay, so we're in a power off descent at about 100 knots, and what I want to try doing is feathering the props, because that should reduce the drag considerably and increase the speed and affect the rate of descent. So 105 knots, maybe 1250 feet per second descent. Now feather the props. We can hear them spin down. What's actually happened is speed's gone up a little bit, the rate of descent's gone down a lot. In fact, we've got a bit of oscillation. The speed's staying about the same, you know, the net speed hasn't really been affected, and if anything the rate of descent has reduced. We look out, we can see the props have actually almost stopped spinning. If I unfeather those, before we ditch, you know, one of the notable things about the turboprop aircraft in general and the Twin Otter in particular is those prop discs, when the power's pulled to idle, provide a huge amount of drag, which is actually very good for a short takeoff and landing aircraft. It means you can do very steep approaches. Now that doesn't appear to be modelled here either, because there should be a very notable difference between descending on feathered props and descending on fully fine props. And I think what we've observed there is there's very little difference, if any, at all. The other thing is, if I just briefly repeat that experiment. So we go back to idle, we get us into a descent. So again, we're on fully fine props, so the prop discs ought to be creating a significant amount of drag. If I feather one, let's say I feather the right prop, I should be getting much more drag from the left engine, which means I should swing left. And actually nothing's happening. Well, that's interesting. That's kind of a nice effect. We're getting the shadow of the feathered prop as it spins down. There it is. So, you know, 10 out of 10 for graphical effects, but 0 out of 10 for the modelling of differential drag, or indeed any drag at all associated with the prop pitch. Now presumably that's a feature of X-Plane rather than specifically of this model, the Twin Otter, because I imagine the Twin Otter is using the X-Plane built-in turboprop behaviour. Alright then, we're going to crack on. We're going to head to Palomar. We're going to land it just to see if some of that engine responsiveness in practice makes this easier to put down than the Twin Otter Extended. So that's final approach. We're about 85 knots. .500 feet per minute. Speed's creeping up a little bit. I'm just tinkering the trim with the trim wheel here. On the autopilot panel, that trim indication's flickering up and down like mad. I don't know why it's doing that. Whether that's a reflection of something wrong with my trim setup or what, but I do seem to be having a little bit of difficulty trimming it consistently. But we're doing okay. So this is the phase where we need that more assertive or rapid response to power changes. So let's see if we're going to get that. Right, we're going to go to another notch of flaps. I'm too high. Got a balloon there with the flap, so I'm trimming it down. This should do. We're at 80 knots, which is, we don't want to go any slower than that. I'm playing with that power. The runway's nice. The runway's not flat, it's following the contours. Speed's good. Do a touchdown right at the threshold. And hold it off. Roll off the power. Whoops, there we go. And we can get reverse. Now that was interesting. You may or may not have noticed what happened there with reverse. This is something I've discovered with X-Plane, which is quite a nice feature. There is a function to swap the power axis or axes between forward thrust and reverse thrust. So you can map that function to the detente at the bottom of the SciTech power levers. I think that can be done on the CH quads as well. And so you can use the same, if you look up here at the power levers, they're currently mapped to forward thrust. If I pull them into the detente and then out again, they're now doing reverse. And likewise if I do it again. That means that in X-Plane I don't need my separate reverse axes. So it's just a nice feature. Okay, let's have a look at the autopilot. The autopilot in the Twin Otter from RW Designs, just like the one in the Twin Otter Extended from Aerosoft, is supposed to be a Collins AP106, which is what you see on the panel here. That trim's still going a bit mad. Of course we have it on the 2D panel here, but don't forget this is non-functional in the X-Plane version because I haven't managed to hook that up yet. Now what we're going to find is the AP106 that's fitted to the RW Designs Twin Otter is lacking in functionality. It seems to be at best a partial implementation of the AP106 and at worst not really an implementation of that autopilot at all. I'll say more about what I mean as we go. Now the other thing that is missing from this implementation of the autopilot that contrasts it with the Twin Otter Extended is, on the Twin Otter Extended we also have a simulation of the FD112V flight director, I'm not sure what it's called, indicator. It's a replacement for the ADI, which includes the flight director steering bars. We don't have that fitted to the RW Designs model, which I think is a bit of a cop-out. What it means is we can't use the flight director without the autopilot being engaged. In the Twin Otter Extended and indeed in a real Twin Otter with this system fitted, we can use the lateral modes, for example nav mode or approach mode, with the autopilot disengaged, but we get steering information, cues if you like, on the ADI to fly manually. So we don't have that. But anyway, let's just take off and check this thing out. I'm going to fly this, although I've hooked it up to some of the buttons on my panel, I'm going to fly this with the mouse initially, just so we make sure that I'm not introducing any artifacts of my own in the way I've hooked this up. So let's get airborne. We're still at Palomar. We're going to take off on runway 24, probably fly back up the coast. Okay, so we've got a bit of altitude now, and I'm just going to engage the autopilot. I don't have any of the autopilot flight director mode set, so I'm just going to flip the on switch. So we're flying at about 120 knots. We're in a bit of a climb, and I think what I'll do is select heading mode. Now if you look at the heading bug is currently set a little bit left of where we are headed. It's set to 140, we're on a heading of about 156. If I engage heading mode, we turn towards where the heading bug is set and establish that heading. Interestingly enough, it actually seems to overshoot that heading very consistently, and then the small period of oscillation and settles down. That's a little bit different from how the Twin Otter Extended flies that function. The other main difference from the Twin Otter Extended is that when you select heading mode in the Twin Otter Extended, it initializes the heading bug to the aircraft's actual heading. Now I don't know if there's pros and cons to each of those different behaviours. I don't know which is actually the way the real AP106 does it. I have a AP106 manual which for a different aircraft, but it's the same autopilot system, and that suggests, if you take the description of the function of the heading bug at face value, it suggests that the RW Designs behaviour is actually the correct one. So that's the heading hold function, and if I change the heading bug, I'll change the heading bug using my hardware switch because I've set that up. So I'm just dialing different heading in there manually, and that seems to work as expected. Again with that overshoot tendency. So that's heading hold. If we add in altitude hold, we're climbing through 7,000 feet, about 7,100. If I click altitude hold, just below 7,100, we're pitching down. And you should see that we're leveled out. Sorry, that's just me, I've got my feet resting on the rudders there. And we're holding just under 7,100. So that's what we'd expect. And of course we have the altitude alert functionality as well. So if I just try and illustrate that, I don't have this hooked up to the panel, so I have to do this manually as well. The target altitude is currently set to 12,400. We're at 7,000. I'll put it at 7,500. Oops, going the wrong way. Well, I'll put it to 7,600. If we select indicated airspeed mode and then initiate a climb by pushing forwards and then press the altitude alert button. So we're in that climb now with a target of 7,600. So we should find that that starts to level off within the next 200 feet. 200 feet, we should have got an indication on the altitude alert. I can't actually see that on the panel because it's in shadow. And indeed it does look like we've started to level off. So that seems to work. The altitude alert works more or less as we'd expected. Now another difference which I'll point out in passing, the only way to initiate a climb when you're on autopilot in this aircraft is to use the IAS hold function. In the Twin Otter Extended and indeed in the real installation of the AP106, you have a thing called a pitch and turn panel, which in the Twin Otter Extended is visible on the top of the yoke pedestal here. There's a thumb wheel and a dial, and I have that implemented on my hardware device using some push buttons, and that is an, if you like, a manual override for the autopilot. You can change the pitch and the bank attitude by using those controls. And that you can use that to initiate a climb. So you can't do that in the RW Designs model. The only way to initiate the climb or descent is to use the IAS function. But what I'm going to do now is, if I can see in this appalling lighting, I'm going to make sure we've got all the lateral and vertical modes switched off. You should be able to see that by looking. Again, if you look at the real documentation for the AP106, these things should light up when you press them, as they do in the, and you can see how they should look on this 2D panel here. These are all lit up with these little orange flashes. That's supposed to be the way the activation is indicated, but that's not implemented on this version of the Twin Otter, which means you have to actually look very closely at them to see if they're pushed in or popped out. So not very helpful. So I have no modes selected at the moment, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to disengage the autopilot. So we're flying straight and level. Then I'm going to put us into a bit of a bank to the right, and then we're going to engage the autopilot. Now that doesn't behave as expected either. The autopilot is engaged with no lateral or vertical mode selected. What it seemed to do there was level the wings. If I disengage it and try that again, I'm going to turn it to the right and actually put a bit of an upward pitch as well. Engage the autopilot and let go. Again, it levels the wings and it seems to restore us to level pitch as well. What that should do is hold the attitude. The AP106, when it's engaged with no lateral or vertical mode selected, is supposed to function as an attitude hold. In fact, there is also on the yoke in the virtual cockpit, there's a button which is labelled CWS, that's control wheel steering. What's supposed to happen is when the autopilot is in attitude hold mode, pressing CWS temporarily disconnects the servos, then you can position the aircraft into a new attitude, let go of the CWS, and it will hold that new attitude. That clearly, even if that button, CWS button, was implemented, which it isn't, that clearly wouldn't work because the attitude hold doesn't work. I mean, in the Twin Otter Extended, the CWS button doesn't work either, but I mean, it's not implemented. It's not that it doesn't work, it's just not implemented. Although you can fake it by mapping your button in such a way that it temporarily disconnects and then reconnects the autopilot. So I've established that we don't have attitude hold as part of the AP106 implementation, which means, you know, so that's a bit of a deficit, which is quite inconvenient, but actually I think it's worse than that. I think it's actually buggy. I'll try and illustrate that. Yeah, we're flying on heading hold and altitude hold. Let's change the heading. We'll give it quite a large deviation on the heading bug, so it's turning towards that. If I now go and switch off heading hold mode, that bank is now retained for reasons which are not at all clear. I can try nudging that and it will go back. I can disconnect the autopilot and I can roll that out. Then if I reconnect the autopilot, we go back onto onto altitude hold, which is correct because that flight director mode is still selected, but it goes back to holding that bank. Now that looks like a brain dead, partial or buggy attempt at implementing the attitude hold. And if I were to do that with, I'll select the GPS and I'll select the nav hold mode. Let's select a different airport just for the purposes of this test. Okay, so we've selected something that's off over that direction. We're on nav mode on the GPS, it's turning us towards it, and I'm going to switch off the nav mode. So now we stay in that bank, and in case you think we're still tracking in nav mode, if you look at the GPS, or if you look at the GPS on the screen here, it's actually gone past the desired track. So we're not actually doing nav mode, we're now in this perpetual bank, and it's going to hold that until we select another lateral mode. Now that's just completely faulty behaviour, and the only way we can actually get out of that is to select heading hold and then wait till it acquires a particular heading at a wings level attitude. What's going on here? Well, I think I know what is going on here. I'm pretty sure that this AP106 so-called is actually just hooked into the default autopilot functions available in X-Plane 11, and I think there's a bug in how this has been implemented. And I know that because when I was trying to program this engage-disengage switch, I had to find the underlying function to activate the autopilot and deactivate it. So I'm just going to repeat one of those experiments, and the only difference is this time I'm going to engage the autopilot using my hardware switch. So the autopilot is currently disengaged, we've got no lateral or vertical mode selected. I'm going to put us into a bank to the left, and I'm going to flip the autopilot master switch on and let go. And you see it's now holding that bank to the left. It's also plummeting towards the ground. I'm not sure why it's doing that. I'm sure there's some interference between the trim wheel and the autopilot trim function. I'll try one more time with that. If I give us a major pitch up, and go on to autopilot. That's near enough 20 degrees pitch up. Yeah, it's trying to hold that. It's probably going to stall us. Speed's dropping off, we're at 70 knots. So it is holding that. If I come off again, if I keep that pitch up and put in a major bank as well, it should hold both of those. So we're holding about 20 degrees up pitch, we're holding a bank of 25 degrees or something. So that's what the attitude hold mode of the AP106 should do. Now I think what's making the difference is when I programmed this switch for the Autopilot master on, I've discovered that the Autopilot master variable in X-Plane has three settings. It has off, it has on, and it has flight director. Now if you set it to flight director, it's going to follow the lateral and vertical modes that are programmed or that are selected on the AP106 input panel. And if no lateral or vertical modes are selected, it's not going to do anything. If you set the autopilot mode to on, it performs it appears to perform the attitude hold function as I've just demonstrated. So I think basically that's a bug in the RW Designs Twin Otter. I think he's incorrectly setting the autopilot mode to flight director when it should be set to on. That's why we're not getting the attitude hold. So I think that's enough to say about the autopilot at the minute. You know, it's a half-hearted implementation of the AP106, very disappointing compared to the one in the Twin Otter Extended. So that's my impressions of the RW Designs Twin Otter for X-Plane 11. Well, actually it's not for X-Plane 11, it's for X-Plane 10. And I suppose for that reason we need to give some of these visual issues a bit of a benefit of the doubt. You know, because they may be attributable to, I'm thinking in particular of that thing where the cockpit shadows keep disappearing and we get this very dark or very light cockpit. That may be an artifact of the switch to X-Plane 11. You know, there's a lot of issues with this aircraft. I wouldn't recommend this aircraft. At the end of the day, it's just a very partial implementation of the Twin Otter. And I'm thinking, you know, going back to the autopilot in particular, which is crucial in flying this aircraft, you know, campaigning it on something like Pilot Edge, you know, flying proper flight plans and attending to air traffic and so on. Having a good autopilot, something that can follow the VORs and the GPS and make approaches. Well, you know, people would argue that it's not essential and not even necessarily realistic, but it adds to the enjoyment factor. It's an idiosyncratic autopilot, the AP106, and in its implementation in the Twin Otter Extended, it's just very enjoyable to work with and very nuanced and quite detailed, even though it is relatively limited. In this aircraft it's not only minimally implemented, it seems to be buggy as well. So that's very disappointing. And the fact that parts of it were just completely left out, you know, the fact that there's no flight director steering bars on the ADI, when the data is clearly available and the developer just hasn't put in the effort to implement that on the display. And then again the manual mode, you know, the absence of the pitch and turn panel. I mean, if you fly X-Plane and you really want a Twin Otter, I don't think you have too many choices. There are a couple, there's at least one freeware one that I've seen references to. Now whether that's any better than this, I would doubt that. But really it's not up to the price tag. And if I'm going to continue with X-Plane, I'm certainly going to be looking for a much more sophisticated twin turboprop aircraft.